Hand over your keycard, Nathan. Catalyst Capital owns 55% of voting shares, and your 15% equity is being liquidated at zero value under the restructuring clause. Julian Mercer sneered across the mahogany boardroom table on the 20th floor. He pushed a crisp white envelope toward me, his designer suit unwrinkled, his eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. I looked at the sleek glass walls of the corporate tower I had helped construct over 15 exhausting years. I picked up the silver pen, signed the acknowledgement slip without a single word of protest, and handed back my keycard. 8 hours later, their $480 million acquisition deal evaporated into thin air. My name is Nathan Cross. I am 48 years old, and for the past 15 years, I served as the Chief Investment Officer and Head of Corporate Development for Nexus Logistics Infrastructure Incorporated. In corporate finance, people often assume that power comes from holding the loudest title or sitting in the biggest office. They look at corporate press releases, glossy investor decks, and board meeting minutes, believing that whoever holds the majority vote controls the company. But in high-stakes mergers and corporate acquisitions, real control is never about titles. Real control lies in the legal architecture hidden deep within the foundational contracts that nobody bothers to reread until it is far too late. To understand how Julian Mercer, a 34-year-old executive with a brand new business degree and zero operational experience, thought he could wipe out my 15% founder equity stake, you have to go back to 2011. 15 years ago, I co-founded Nexus alongside Lawrence Mercer, Julian's father. Back then, Lawrence was a brilliant visionary who understood hardware, physical warehouses, and long-haul trucking routes, but he lacked the financial structuring expertise required to scale a regional freight firm into a national enterprise. I brought 22 years of corporate finance and M&A experience to the table. When Lawrence and I started Nexus in a cramped office near the Port of Baltimore, we built the foundation block by block. I structured our initial Series A round, negotiated our banking credit lines, and secured our commercial leases across 40 states. Over the years, as Nexus expanded from a modest regional fleet into a sprawling logistics powerhouse with $120 million in annual recurring revenue and 400 distribution hubs, Lawrence handled external public relations while I ran the internal corporate asset architecture. I managed every debt refinancing, every capital expenditure model, and every intellectual property acquisition. By 2018, 8 years into our growth, Nexus hit an operational bottleneck. Our physical fleet was huge, but our freight routing efficiency was failing under the weight of regional congestion. That was when I personally discovered a small software development firm in Dallas, Texas that had created an extraordinary automated dispatch algorithm called vector routing. The software could real-time calculate optimal fuel routes, freight capacity matching, and driver shift scheduling, instantly slashing fuel overhead by 24% and increasing terminal throughput by 31%. The owner of Vector Routing was willing to sell, but the Nexus board of directors at the time was hesitant to allocate corporate cash towards software assets. Lawrence Mercer was focused on buying more physical tractor trailers. Knowing that this technology was the absolute backbone of our company's future operational dominance, I took a calculated risk. I personally put up $3.5 million of my own liquid private capital to acquire the underlying software source code, patents, and technical architecture under a separate holding entity I created, Cross Capital Holdings LLC, which operated through Nexus IP Holdings LLC. When I licensed the vector routing technology back to Nexus Logistics Infrastructure in 2018, I drafted the master intellectual property license agreement myself. I wasn't greedy. I charged Nexus a nominal operating license fee of just $1 per year so the company could maximize its profit margins and reinvest capital into physical expansion. But because I was using my own private money to fund the software development while serving as Chief Investment Officer, I embedded a very specific, non-assignable protective mechanism into Section 9.4 of the operating agreement. Section 9. 4 explicitly stated that the master intellectual property license was granted exclusively to Nexus Logistics Infrastructure Incorporated so long as the original founding management team retained executive control and equity alignment. Furthermore, Section 9.4 contained an explicit change of control and anti-dilution clause. Any proposed merger, acquisition, corporate restructuring, or asset transfer exceeding $50 million required 100% unanimous written approval from all Class B founder equity holders, which meant my personal sign-off was legally mandatory. If any entity attempted to execute a forced corporate takeover or forcibly cancel Class B founder equity without prior unanimous consent, the master IP license would automatically terminate at midnight on the date of breach, and all proprietary software algorithms, source code repositories, and patent rights would immediately revert to Cross Capital Holdings, LLC. For years, Lawrence Mercer respected our partnership. He knew I held the structural keys to the operational engine, and together we turned Nexus into an industry titan. But 3 years ago, in 2023, Lawrence retired to his estate in Florida due to declining health, leaving his son, Julian Mercer, on the board. Julian had spent his 20s hopping between luxury private equity internships and high-priced consulting firms, accumulating a vast appetite for corporate prestige without understanding a single line of operational reality. When Julian stepped into the CEO position, he immediately brought in Catalyst Capital, a predatory private equity firm managed by a cutthroat dealmaker named Lyle Vance. Julian and Lyle saw Nexus not as a long-term enterprise built on relationships and legal integrity, but as a cash cow ripe for strip mining. Their goal was simple: execute a rapid leveraged buyout, sell off our real estate assets, and flip the company to an international conglomerate for $480 million. There was only one obstacle standing in their way: my 15% founder equity stake. Under a standard $480 million valuation, my 15% stake was worth $72 million. Julian and Lyle Vance had no intention of paying a founder $72 million when they could use corporate legal maneuvers to squeeze me out. They spent 6 months drafting secret corporate restructuring documents, preparing a hostile squeeze-out merger designed to dilute my shares to zero and terminate my employment right before closing the deal. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought a 48-year-old corporate officer would panic and beg for a minor settlement. They had no idea that every step they were taking was marching them straight into a legal landmine I had planted 8 years ago. The crisis erupted on a humid Friday afternoon in mid-July at precisely 4 o'clock. I was in my office reviewing the quarterly audit reports for our regional fulfillment centers when my desk phone rang. It was Julian Mercer's executive assistant, asking me to report to the main executive boardroom immediately for an unscheduled meeting with the board of directors and representatives from Catalyst Capital. When I walked into the 20th floor boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with calculated arrogance. Sitting at the head of the conference table was Julian Mercer, wearing an expensive tailored suit, adjusting his silk tie with a smug smirk. To his right sat Lyle Vance, the senior managing director of Catalyst Capital, flanked by 3 junior corporate attorneys holding heavy leather-bound transaction folders. The projector at the front of the room displayed a massive presentation slide titled Project Nexus Titan, Final Acquisition and Capital Restructuring. "Thank you for joining us, Nathan," Julian said, not even bothering to offer me a seat. He gestured toward the screen with a laser pointer. "We are finalizing the definitive agreement for Catalyst Capital to acquire 100% of Nexus Logistics Infrastructure Incorporated for $480 million. The transaction closes tonight at midnight, with full capital transfer scheduled for Monday morning." I sat down at the far end of the table, opened my leather notepad, and looked Julian straight in the eyes. $480 million is a solid valuation, I replied calmly. However, as Chief Investment Officer and holder of 15% Class B founder equity, I have not received the definitive merger disclosure, nor have I executed the mandatory unanimous consent agreement required under our corporate charter. Lyle Vance chuckled, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. That's where you're mistaken, Mr. Cross, Lyle said in a smooth, patronizing voice. Over the past 72 hours, Catalyst Capital acquired an additional 40% block of voting shares from secondary institutional investors, bringing our total combined voting power alongside Julian's holdings to 55%. Under Delaware General Corporation Law Section 251, a 55% majority is more than sufficient to approve a statutory squeeze-out merger. Julian leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of water before delivering the punchline he had clearly rehearsed for weeks. Effective immediately at 5 o'clock today, your position as Chief Investment Officer is eliminated due to corporate redundancy. Furthermore, as part of the merger restructuring, all Class B founder equity shares are being reclassified and liquidated at zero net conversion value to clear corporate liabilities. In short, Nathan, you're fired, your shares are canceled, and you have no say in this deal. He slid a heavy manila envelope across the table. Inside was a formal termination notice, along with a release of claims document, offering me a paltry 2 weeks of accrued vacation pay in exchange for waiving all future legal rights against Nexus and Catalyst Capital. I carefully scanned the document. My years in corporate M&A had taught me that when an opponent believes they have absolute leverage, they become careless. They focus entirely on the illusion of their overwhelming vote count and completely ignore the underlying contractual web. So let me ensure I understand the board's position correctly, I said, keeping my voice level and unhurried. You are executing a major corporate restructuring and asset transfer exceeding $50 million. You are doing so without my written consent, and you are unilaterally declaring my 15% Class B founder equity to be worth $0. That is correct. Julian sneered, tapping his pen against the table. We control 55% of the voting power. Your veto is mathematically worthless, Nathan. You spent 15 years building this company, but you belong to the past. Catalyst Capital represents the future. We don't need an outdated founder hovering over our balance sheet when we have a $480 million buyout on the table. You have 10 minutes to clear your personal belongings from your office. Security will escort you out of the building. Lyle Vance smiled, handing me a silver Montblanc pen. Sign the acknowledgement of termination, Nathan. Make this easy on yourself. You've had a good run. Instead of arguing, raising my voice, or threatening litigation, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my own pen, and calmly signed the bottom of the termination receipt. But before sliding it back across the table, I looked directly at Julian Mercer. I need you to sign this copy as well, Julian, I said softly. As Chief Executive Officer, confirming that this termination and equity reclassification is being executed on behalf of the board without my consent, effective 5 o'clock today. Julian chuckled condescendingly, taking the pens and scribbling his flourished signature across the page. If it makes you feel like you have closure, Nathan, I'll sign whatever you want. It doesn't change the fact that by midnight tonight, Catalyst Capital owns this entire enterprise, and you walk away with nothing. Understood, I said. I picked up the signed original copy, folded it neatly, and placed it inside my inner suit pocket. I unclipped my brass keycard and corporate identification badge from my lapel, laid them gently on the table, picked up my leather briefcase, and stood up. As I walked toward the boardroom door, Julian called out from behind me, his voice echoing off the glass walls. Don't bother trying to call your legal team on Monday morning, Nathan. Catalyst Capital has a retainer budget of $10 million for litigation. You can't fight 55% voting control. I turned around at the door, gave Julian a courteous nod, and replied, Have a pleasant weekend, Julian. Best of luck with the closing tonight. At 4:45 p.m., I walked out of the corporate headquarters of Nexus Logistics Infrastructure. The security guard at the front lobby looked at me with confusion as I handed him my parking pass, but I simply smiled and walked out into the warm summer afternoon air. I got into my sedan, started the engine, and looked up at the 20th floor windows. Julian Mercer and Lyle Vance were opening a bottle of champagne in the conference room. They thought they had just pulled off the ultimate corporate coup. They had no idea that in less than 7 hours, the entire operational heart of their $480 million empire was going to stop beating. I arrived at my home in the quiet suburbs of Annapolis at 5:45 p.m. The house was calm and still. I took off my suit jacket, hung it in the closet, and walked into my private study. I poured 2 fingers of 18-year-old single malt scotch into a crystal tumbler, sat down at my heavy mahogany desk, and pulled out my personal laptop. A machine that had never been connected to the Nexus corporate server network. At 6:30 p.m., I dialed a direct number. After 2 rings, a sharp, authoritative voice answered. It was Clara Garrick, a veteran senior corporate partner at one of the premier M&A law firms in Washington, D.C. Clara had represented me for over 12 years and knew the precise architectural details of every deal I had ever constructed. "Nathan," Clara said, her tone businesslike yet warm. "I take it Julian Mercer and Catalyst Capital executed their maneuver today." "They did, Clara," I replied, taking a slow sip of scotch. "They called an emergency board meeting at 4 o'clock. Lyle Vance claimed 55% voting majority under Delaware Section 251. Julian handed me a termination notice for corporate redundancies, canceled my Class B founder equity shares at zero value, and had security escort me out of the building. And I have Julian's explicit signature on the termination notice confirming the exact grounds." On the other end of the line, Clara let out a low, amused laugh. "Julian Mercer actually signed a document confirming he terminated your founder executive role and repudiated Class B equity right before closing a $480 million buyout. He signed it in front of 3 witnesses and Lyle Vance himself," I said. "He was so blinded by the $480 million headline figure that he didn't even consult the 2018 Master IP license agreement." "Unbelievable," Clara said, the sound of paper rustling over the phone. "Let's review the exact language of Section 9.4 for the record. Under the terms of the Master Intellectual Property License Agreement established in 2018 between CrossCaf Capital Holdings LLC and Nexus Logistics Infrastructure Incorporated, the grant of the vector routing proprietary dispatch algorithm, real-time cargo optimization architecture, and source code patents is strictly contingent upon 2 mandatory operational conditions. First, the undiluted preservation of Class B founder equity. Second, unanimous written consent for any change of control exceeding $50 million. "Correct," I confirmed. Section 9.4 paragraph C explicitly states that any attempted forced redemption of Class B equity or executive termination without prior unanimous consent constitutes an immediate incurable material breach. Upon occurrence of such breach, the license granted to Nexus Logistics automatically terminates at midnight on the date of breach, with all intellectual property, source code, hosting access, and patent rights immediately reverting to Cross Capital Holdings LLC. And under Title 17 of the United States Code Section 106, Clara added smoothly, continued unauthorized use of copyrighted source code and proprietary algorithms following license. Revocation constitutes willful intellectual property infringement, subject to statutory damages, immediate federal injunctive relief, and personal corporate officer liability. "Precisely," I said. "What is the status of our escrow notification filings?" "Everything is prepared," Clara responded. "We have the formal notice of default, the IP revocation certificate, and the emergency federal injunction petition drafted. The moment you execute the digital revocation on your end, my firm will simultaneously serve formal legal notice to Catalyst Capital's lead transaction escrow agent at J.P. Morgan Chase, the SEC Edgar filing desk, and the board of directors of Nexus. Thank you, Clara. Stand by." I hung up the phone and looked at the clock on my computer screen. It was 11:45 p.m. In New York, the legal teams for Catalyst Capital and Julian Mercer were likely sitting in a high-rise office tower surrounded by takeout boxes and empty coffee cups, preparing to initiate the wire transfer of $480 million to complete the acquisition at midnight. They believe that by acquiring 55% of common voting shares, they own Nexus lock, stock, and barrel. But what they failed to comprehend was that Nexus Logistics Infrastructure did not actually own the routing software that made their 400 distribution centers function. Nexus was merely a licensee. Without vector routing, Nexus was nothing more than 400 empty concrete warehouses and thousands of idle trucks sitting on parking lots. At 11:58 p.m., I opened the encrypted portal for Cross Capital Holdings LLC. I inserted my physical two-factor authentication hardware security token into the USB port. The screen illuminated with a crimson command line prompt. Lytherus Gramenermistration Portal. Vir Moting System v4.8. I typed in my administrator credentials and navigated to Section 9.4, License Compliance Control. The status monitor displayed 400 active node connections across 40 states, processing over 180,000 real-time freight dispatches per hour. At precisely 11:59 and 50 seconds p.m., I placed my finger over the Enter key. At midnight, July 19th, the system clock clicked over to 1200 a.m. I pressed Enter. A clean, stark message appeared across the screen. Executive Mandate. Section 9.4 Breach confirmed. Master IP license terminated. All SSL certificates revoked. Sankso Co. Hosting reverted to Cross Capital Holdings, LLC. Across the nation at 400 freight terminals, the digital heartbeat of Nexus Logistics infrastructure went dark. The server connection severed instantly. The automated dispatch screens froze. The GPS fleet tracking modules disconnected. I closed my laptop, placed my empty scotch glass in the sink, and turned off the study light. Then, I turned my cell phone on silent mode, placed it face down on my nightstand, and went to sleep. I woke up at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, enjoyed a quiet breakfast, and spent the morning working in my garden. When I finally checked my personal phone at noon, the screen was practically glowing with notifications. There were 84 missed calls, 36 frantic text messages, and dozens of urgent emails from Julian Mercer, Lyle Vance, and various senior vice presidents at Nexus. Over the weekend, absolute chaos paralyzed the operations of Nexus Logistics infrastructure. Without the vector routing software engine running, the company's 400 distribution hubs across North America collapsed into operational paralysis. Across 40 states, over 12,000 long-haul tractor trailers were stuck at terminal gates, unable to receive automated load manifests or route verification certificates. Terminal managers had to resort to paper logging, resulting in massive 60-mile traffic jams outside major freight hubs in Chicago, Atlanta, and Dallas. Worse yet, over $40 million of temperature-sensitive cold storage cargo was stranded on highway shoulders without real-time climate telemetry updates. By Sunday evening, the national logistics news outlets were reporting on a massive, unexplained system breakdown at Nexus. Major corporate clients, including retail giants that relied on Nexus for just-in-time inventory delivery, were issuing formal notices of breach and threatening multi-million-dollar contract cancellation penalties. Meanwhile, in New York, the legal framework of Catalyst Capital's deal fell apart completely. At 8 o'clock on Monday morning, when the transaction escrow desk at J.P. Morgan Chase received Clara Garrick's official filing, complete with the U.S. Copyright Office revocation certificate and Julian Mercer's signed termination receipt, they immediately froze the $480 million acquisition escrow fund. Under the terms of the private equity acquisition agreement, Catalyst Capital had conditioned their cash payout on receiving clear, unencumbered title to all operational intellectual property. Lyle Vance's legal team realized within minutes that Julian Mercer had lied on the transaction disclosure certificates. Julian had warranted that Nexus owned all core operating software, completely hiding the existence of Section 9.4 and the separate ownership structure of Cross Capital Holdings, LLC. Under federal corporate securities law, Julian had committed material fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, exposing himself and the board of directors to massive criminal and civil liability. At 8:45 a.m. on Monday, a sleek black luxury SUV pulled up to the driveway of my Annapolis home. I was sitting on my front porch drinking fresh coffee alongside Clara Garrick when the SUV doors opened. Out stepped Julian Mercer and Lyle Vance. The contrast between Friday afternoon and Monday morning was staggering. Julian's designer suit was rumpled, his hair unkempt, his face pale and sunken from 2 sleepless nights. Lyle Vance looked equally shaken, holding a thick leather briefcase with hands that visibly trembled. Julian sprinted up the brick walkway toward my porch, stopping at the foot of the stairs, breathing heavily. "Nathan, what the hell did you do?" Julian yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. The servers are completely down. Our dispatch network is dark. 400 terminals are locked. Catalyst Bank froze the $480 million wire. What did you do to the system? I slowly set my coffee cup down on the side table, looked at Julian with a calm, unbothered expression, and replied, I didn't do anything to your system, Julian. I simply followed the exact terms of the contracts you signed. Lyle Vance stepped forward, attempting to project executive authority, though his voice lacked conviction. Mr. Cross, this is illegal sabotage. You deliberately disabled proprietary corporate assets during an active corporate transaction. If you don't restore server access within the hour, Catalyst Capital will file an emergency federal lawsuit for tortious interference and breach of fiduciary duty. Clara. Garrick stood up from her chair, pulled a blue-bound legal portfolio from her briefcase, and laid it on the porch railing. Mr. Vance, I suggest you take a deep breath and read the Delaware Chancery Court filing we submitted at 7 o'clock this morning, Clara said in a cold, precise tone. Under Section 9.4 of the 2018 Master IP License Agreement, which Julian Mercer's father authorized and which Julian personally ratified, the vector routing software was never corporate property of Nexus. It is owned entirely by Cross Capital Holdings LLC, an independent entity owned 100% by Nathan Cross. Lyle Vance froze, his jaw dropping as he stared at Clara. What? Furthermore, Clara continued, turning her sharp gaze directly to Julian, Section 9.4 explicitly states that any unilateral attempt to dilute Class B founder equity or terminate Mr. Cross's executive role without unanimous written consent constitutes an immediate, incurable breach resulting in automatic license revocation. When Julian signed Mr. Cross's termination notice on Friday at 5 p.m., he personally triggered the automatic termination clause. Julian looked like he had been struck by lightning. He turned to Lyle Vance, his eyes wide with horror. Lyle, you told me we could squeeze him out under Delaware Section 251. You said 55% voting power overruled everything. Delaware Section 251 governs corporate stock mergers, Julian, not third-party intellectual property licenses, Clara countered sharply. Because you failed to perform basic legal due diligence, you signed transaction documents with Catalyst Capital guaranteeing clear title to assets Nexus didn't own. Under 8 Delaware Code Section 144 and Title 17 U.S. Code Section 106, Julian Mercer is personally liable for material fraud, misrepresentation, and willful copyright infringement. Catalyst Capital's buyout isn't closing. In fact, if Nexus isn't liquidated by Friday, your firm will be facing over $80 million in operational breach claims from freight clients. Julian slumped onto the bottom porch step, burying his head in his hands. The arrogant young executive who had sneered across the boardroom table 3 days ago was now reduced to total panic. Nathan, please, Julian begged, looking up at me with bloodshot eyes. I made a mistake. We can fix this. I'll restore your chief investment officer title. I'll give you whatever seat on the board you want. Just turn the software back on. If this deal collapses, Catalyst will sue me for fraud, and the company will go bankrupt. I looked down at Julian, my voice calm and devoid of anger. You told me on Friday that I belonged to the past, Julian. You said my veto was mathematically worthless. Now you're going to learn what real legal leverage looks like. At 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon, the final resolution meeting convened in the high-rise conference room of Clara Garrick's law firm in downtown Washington, D.C. The room was packed with corporate attorneys, senior managing partners from Catalyst Capital, representatives from J.P. Morgan Chase, and the remaining members of the Nexus Board of Directors. Julian Mercer sat in the corner, silent and crushed, surrounded by corporate defense attorneys who had already advised him that his executive career was over. Lyle Vance sat across from me, his arrogance entirely replaced by cold commercial pragmatism. Catalyst Capital had already invested $75 million of institutional funds into debt financing for the transaction. Allowing Nexus to collapse into bankruptcy meant taking a complete loss and destroying their firm's market reputation. Clara Garrick stood at the head of the conference table, distributing the master settlement framework. Here are the non-negotiable terms for the resolution of Cross Capital Holdings versus Nexus Logistics Infrastructure and Catalyst Capital. Clara announced in a voice that left zero room for counteroffers. First, Julian Mercer will execute an immediate, irrevocable resignation from his position as Chief Executive Officer and member of the Board of Directors of Nexus Logistics Infrastructure Incorporated. He will forfeit all unvested stock options and face a formal board inquiry into breach of fiduciary duty. Julian didn't even raise his head. He silently picked up a pen and signed the resignation document. Second, Clara continued, Catalyst Capital will execute an outright asset acquisition of the Vector Routing Master intellectual property portfolio from Cross Capital Holdings, LLC. Pursuant to Clause 12C of the 2018 Operating Agreement governing willful license breach, the buyout price is set at 3 times fair market value, totaling $108 million in immediate cash capital. Lyle Vance swallowed hard, looking at his lead transaction counsel. The attorney gave a subtle nod. Paying $108 million for the IP was painful, but it was the only way to save their $480 million acquisition asset from total liquidation. Lyle signed the cash transfer authorization. Third, Clara concluded, in exchange for granting a perpetual, non-exclusive operational license to the restructured entity, Nexus Global Logistics Corporation, Nathan Cross will receive 25% voting preferred equity in the parent company, along with an immediate appointment as chairman of the board of directors with absolute veto authority over all future debt issuances, asset dispositions, and corporate restructuring. Lyle Vance looked across the table at me, signed the final page of the master agreement, and slid the file across the table. You played a perfect game of corporate finance, Mr. Cross. You had us trapped before we even sat down at the table on Friday. In corporate finance, Mr. Vance, I replied quietly, you should never attempt to cut out the person who built the foundation. Numbers on a spreadsheet only matter if the underlying asset actually belongs to you. At 4:30 p.m., the wire transfer confirmation landed on my secure tablet. Tranashen confirmed. $108 million deposit to Cross Capital Holdings. I opened my laptop, accessed the administrator portal of Vector Routing, and entered the master restoration key code. At 5:00 p.m., the digital network across all 400 logistics terminals flared back to life. The server indicators turned from flashing crimson to solid green. The automated dispatch algorithms resumed calculating optimal freight routes across 40 states. 12,000 trucks began moving again, carrying cargo smoothly to their destinations. In the weeks that followed, the corporate landscape settled into its new reality. Julian Mercer was formally removed from all executive boards in the industry, facing personal civil lawsuits from minority shareholders for misrepresentation during the merger attempt. His corporate reputation was thoroughly ruined, and he retreated from the business world entirely. As for Nexus Global Logistics Corporation, the company entered its most profitable era in history. Under my leadership as chairman of the board, we expanded our automated logistics network into international shipping channels, increasing annual recurring revenue past $200 million. Sometimes, when I sit in my corner office on the top floor of our corporate headquarters, I look down at the bustling freight yards below. In the corporate world, people often admire the aggressive dealmakers, the flashy executives, and the arrogant private equity managers who talk about 55% voting power and swift buyouts. But true strength in business does not come from noise or intimidation. It comes from quiet preparation, meticulous contractual foresight, and knowing precisely when to hold the key.